Texas, late October. The sun bleeds red across a flat, merciless land. The wagon stops. Caleb jumps down and freezes a woman. Face down in the ditch, rope burns on her wrists, jaw purple with bruises but still breathing. Then hoofbeats. 3 riders close fast. That woman's a thief. Hand her over to Mr. Boone. Caleb squares his shoulders, voice dead calm, no warrant, no handover. That's how the law works. A man, a woman on the run. A little girl who understood before any of them that some debts can't be left in a ditch. Watch now and find out if they make it out alive. The wagon hit a rut, and Lily grabbed the board with both hands. Papa, I see it. Caleb Reed steadied the reins and guided the horses around the next stretch of uneven road. The sky had turned that deep amber color it always got in late October, low and wide over the Texas flatland, and the air smelled like dry grass and coming cold. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she pointed. "What's that?" Caleb squinted. Something dark lay in the ditch beside the road, maybe 30 yards ahead. A pile of cloth, he thought at first, or an old saddle somebody had dropped. But he slowed the horses anyway. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. Lily started to follow. "Stay put," he said. He walked closer, and then he stopped walking. It was a woman. She lay on her side in the dirt, one arm stretched beneath her and the other curled against her chest. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her face was bruised along the jaw and beneath her left eye. Her wrists were marked with raw red lines, the kind rope leaves after a long struggle. Caleb crouched and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. A pulse, steady but faint. He exhaled slowly. Then he heard hooves. 3 riders came up the road from the south, moving at a canter. They wore the same burnt brown jackets Caleb had seen on the Boone Ranch hands in town, and they slowed when they spotted him, kneeling beside the ditch. The one in front was a big man with a flat, wide face, and a voice that came out too loud, the way men talk when they're used to people stepping back. "That woman give you trouble, sir?" Caleb stood. "She's unconscious." "Yeah," the man leaned forward in his saddle. "She does that. Name's Hannah Cole. She stole the Boone Ranch payroll, attacked one of our guards, and ran." He paused, long enough to make it feel like a warning. "Mr. Boone wants her returned." Caleb looked at the woman in the dirt. The bruises on her face weren't new. They had that deep purple color that took time to develop. And rope marks didn't come from a short struggle. "You got a warrant?" Caleb said. "Don't need one. She's Boone's problem, and he'll handle it." "That's not how the law works." The man's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went flat. "Sir, I'd strongly recommend you step aside and let us take her. You don't want to make this your business." Caleb knew the name Silas Boone. Everyone in the county did. Richest landowner for 50 miles, with enough money to make problems disappear, and enough hired men to make sure they stayed gone. He had no way to know which side was telling the truth, and he had Lily in the wagon. He was about to step aside. Then he heard the creak of the wagon board behind him and small feet landing in the dirt. Lily, but she was already there, standing at his elbow, staring down at the woman on the ground. Her eyes went wide. She grabbed his sleeve and pulled hard until he bent down to her level. Then she leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Papa, she's the woman who pulled me from the river." Caleb went very still. Last spring at the town fair, the river had been running fast from the spring melt. Lily had slipped off the bank during the crowd and gone under in seconds. A woman had jumped in after her, without stopping to think, without asking anyone's permission, without waiting to see if someone more capable would go first. She had pulled Lily out and handed her to Caleb on the bank, and by the time he'd looked up again to find her, she was gone. He had never learned her name. He stood back up and looked at the 3 riders. "She was already dead when I got here," he said. The big man frowned. "What?" "The woman. She was dead when I found her. Nothing to return." He kept his voice flat and even. "I'm sorry for your trouble." The riders exchanged glances. The man in front studied Caleb for a long moment, then looked past him at the wagon. "That's so," he said. "That's so. Another pause. Then the man pulled his horse back and the three of them rode on, slow enough to make a point. Caleb waited until they were small shapes on the horizon. Then he moved fast. He pulled the loose hay from the back of the wagon and lifted Hannah carefully, one arm beneath her shoulders and one beneath her knees. She was lighter than he expected. He settled her into the wagon bed and covered her with the hay until only a narrow gap remained for air. He had just climbed back to the seat when her hand came up through the hay and caught his wrist. Her grip was weak, but it was there. Her eyes opened, dark eyes, clouded with pain but sharp underneath. She looked at him, then at Lily, then back at him. "Boone," she said. The word came out rough, like she was pushing it through gravel. "I know," Caleb said. "You said I was dead." "I did." She held his gaze for a moment, measuring something. "They won't believe you for long." "Probably not." Her hand tightened on his wrist. "The men hunting me, they don't stop." She swallowed. "Not because you turned them away. Not because you told them a story. They don't stop, I understand that." She looked at him the way people look when they've been told something is safe and found out it wasn't. She closed her eyes and her grip loosened, and she sank back into the hay. Caleb clicked his tongue and got the horses moving. He didn't head toward town. Town was where Boone's people would be watching. He turned the wagon north, toward his ranch, and kept the horses at a steady pace. Lily sat close to him on the seat, her hands folded in her lap, not saying anything. She was 8 years old, and had already learned that some moments didn't need words. "A mile up the road," she said. "She's going to be all right." "I hope so," Caleb said. "She was brave when she saved me. She didn't even take off her boots." He looked down at his daughter and felt something move through him, quiet and certain. He had been about to walk away. He had been standing right there at the edge of it, the practical decision, the safe one, the one that kept Lily out of Silas Boone's path. And this woman had jumped into a cold river without taking off her boots. The sun was almost down by the time the ranch came into view, the low fence posts and the dark shape of the barn against the sky. He brought the wagon around to the back, away from the road. He had just lifted Hannah from the wagon bed when her eyes opened again. For a moment she looked around at the ranch, the fence, the house, the open land. Then she looked at Caleb, standing there, holding her, like it was a perfectly ordinary thing to do. Low and hoarse, "They'll use your little girl to force me back." Caleb looked at her face, the bruises, the cut along her hairline, the exhaustion sitting deep in her eyes. "Let me worry about that," he said. "You should have left me in the ditch." "Maybe," he said. "But I didn't." He carried her inside. Behind him, one of the riders had circled back. The man sat on his horse at the far edge of the road, watching the wagon's wheel as it turned in the fading light. The wheel had a long, dark smear along its rim. The man looked at it for a moment. Then he turned his horse back toward the Boone Ranch. Dr. Eleanor Webb arrived before sunrise. She came through the back door with a lantern and a leather bag, her gray hair pinned up tight, her expression calm in the focused way of someone who has seen worse and kept moving. Caleb had sent his ranch hand, Curtis, to fetch her the night before, and she'd come without asking too many questions. She examined Hannah for a long time. Caleb waited in the hallway. When Webb finally stepped out, she pulled the door halfway closed behind her and kept her voice low. Whoever did this used their fists and something harder, probably a boot. She folded her hands together. "Her ribs are bruised, not broken. The cut on her head is clean. The rope marks on her wrists will heal." She looked at Caleb steadily. This was not a fall from a horse. It was not a wagon accident. Someone held her down and beat her. Caleb said nothing. "She'll need rest," Webb continued. "A week at least before she should be riding anywhere she can have it." Webb studied him. "Caleb, do you know what you're holding on to here? I'm starting to understand it." She picked up her bag. "I'll come back tomorrow." When Hannah woke later that morning, Caleb brought her water and a plate of bread and cold meat. He set it on the small table beside the bed and stepped back, giving her room. She watched him do it. "I'm not going to run," she said. "I didn't think you were. You stepped back. There's not much space in here." he said simply. She ate slowly. He could see her thinking while she chewed, sorting through what to say and what to leave out. He'd seen that look before in men who'd been through trouble and learned to measure their words before spending them. I was working at the Boone Ranch, she said finally. Housekeeping. Horse care. She paused. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. When I wouldn't lie about it, Silas Boone accused me of stealing the ranch payroll and locked me in a storage room. She looked at the wall. I didn't steal anything. I believe you. She glanced at him, quick, like the word surprised her. You can stay until you're strong enough to travel, Caleb said. But I need you to tell me about any danger that could reach Lily. That's my one condition. Hannah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have a condition, too. He waited. You don't surrender me to Boone, and you don't make decisions about my future without talking to me first. Caleb looked at her. She was bruised and tired and flat on her back in a borrowed bed, and she was still negotiating. Agreed, he said. She gave a short nod and went back to eating. Lily came in after lunch, quiet as a cat, and stood near the doorway until Hannah noticed her. The girl was holding something small in her closed fist. You can come in, Hannah said. Lily crossed the room and opened her hand. Inside was a folded square of white cloth, worn soft at the edges. I kept it, Lily said. From the river. You dropped it when you got out of the water. Hannah looked at the handkerchief for a long moment. A small embroidered H in the corner, faded but still visible. She took it gently. I wondered where that went. Lily sat on the edge of the bed, satisfied, like a puzzle that had finally come together. Caleb watched from the doorway. He'd told himself he didn't let women stay at the ranch. Not since Sarah left 4 years back. It hadn't been a rule he'd made out loud. It had just become the shape of things, the way water finds the low ground and stays there. He watched Lily explain to Hannah exactly how she'd kept the handkerchief folded inside her winter coat pocket for 6 months. And he didn't say anything. That afternoon, Boone's foreman rode up to the front fence. Curtis came and got Caleb. The foreman was a lean man named Tidwell, and he held out a folded paper like he was doing Caleb a courtesy. Public notice, Tidwell said. Hannah Cole wanted for theft of the Boone Ranch payroll. Mr. Boone is prepared to pay for her safe return. Caleb took the paper, read it, and handed it back. This isn't a warrant, he said. Sheriff Grant didn't sign this. A private notice from a private man isn't worth the paper it's on. Tidwell's jaw tightened. Mr. Boone thought you might say that. Then Mr. Boone already has his answer. Tidwell held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he folded the paper, tucked it inside his coat, and rode back the way he came. Caleb stood at the fence and watched him go. That night he sat at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed, going over the feed ledger without reading any of it. He heard footsteps in the hall, too careful to be Lily. He went out to the barn. Hannah was there, moving slowly, one hand against the wall for balance. She'd gotten a saddle partway up onto the rail before her ribs stopped her. She was standing with her forehead resting against the horse's neck, breathing through her teeth. Caleb picked up the saddle and set it back on its rack. Boone's men are watching the south road, he said. Curtis saw their fire an hour ago. You'd ride straight into them. She didn't answer. I'm not telling you that you can't leave, he said. I told you I wouldn't do that. But I want you to know what's out there before you decide. Hannah straightened slowly. She looked at the horse, then at the saddle, then at the dark rectangle of the barn door, and whatever was beyond it. She turned around and walked back toward the house. Caleb followed at a distance, close enough to catch her if her legs gave out, far enough to give her the choice. She made it to the guest room on her own. He checked Lily's room before he went to bed. The curtains were still. The room was quiet. He reached for the window latch, just habit, just to make sure it was down. His fingers found the place where the latch should have been. It was cut clean, a small deliberate cut, made with something thin and sharp. He crouched and looked at the floor. Near the foot of the bed, mostly hidden in the shadow beneath the frame, was a boot print. Large, muddy, recent. Caleb stood up and stood very still for a long moment. Then he pulled Lily's blanket up, gently, without waking her, and went to sit in the chair beside her door for the rest of the night. By morning, Caleb had nailed the window shut and moved a heavy trunk beneath it. He checked the other windows in the house. He checked the barn latch and the gate hinges and the lock on the grain room where they kept the tools. Curtis helped without being asked. Hannah watched all of it from the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, her color better than the day before. "I can help," she said when Caleb came back around. "You need rest. I've been resting." She pushed off the post she'd been leaning against. "Tell me what to do." He handed her a short list of the barn inventory he needed counted. It wasn't heavy work, and they both knew it, but she took the list without comment and went to do it. He noticed she didn't sway as much walking back across the yard. An hour later, one of his hands came running from the south pasture. "The bay mare, Mr. Reed." "She's down." Caleb got there fast. The mare was on her side in the stall, sides heaving, and the foal she was carrying wasn't coming right. He could see that much immediately. He'd lost a mare this way before, 5 years back. He hadn't forgotten the sound of it. He heard footsteps behind him and looked up. Hannah was in the stall entrance, already reading the situation. "The foal's positioned wrong," she said. "Head's back." "You sure? I've done this 3 times at the Boone Ranch." She was already crouching, already moving. "I'll need your hands." "Mine aren't strong enough right now." She told him exactly what to do, quietly and clearly, without repeating herself. She guided him through repositioning the foal, talked him through the pressure and the timing, and kept one hand on the mare's neck the whole time, steady and calm. 20 minutes later, the foal was on the ground, wet and breathing. Caleb sat back on his heels. He looked at Hannah across the stall. She was pale from the effort, one arm pressed against her side where her ribs still ached. But she was watching the foal try to figure out its legs, and something in her face had gone soft. "Good," she said quietly. "She's good." He helped Hannah up, and they walked back to the house slowly. Lily came running out to see the foal and nearly knocked them both sideways. Later, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them, Lily said, "Papa never lets anyone stay very long. Not since Mama went." Hannah glanced at Caleb. "Lily," he said, "it's true." Lily said simply, and went back to drawing horses on her slate board. Hannah looked at her coffee. "Where did she go?" "Back east," Caleb said. "She couldn't manage it out here. The distance, the weather, the quiet." He turned his cup once on the table. "I don't hold it against her." Hannah nodded slowly. He cleared his throat. "There's something I need to know. If we're going to get ahead of Boone, I need the whole truth, not the part you've decided is safe to share." She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him Roy Boone had been beating Sam Walker, a 15-year-old stable boy, when Ben Hayes came into the barn. Ben was one of the older ranch hands, steady and quiet, the kind of man who didn't look for trouble, but didn't walk past it either. He stepped between Roy and Sam. Roy picked up an iron branding handle and struck Ben in the head. Ben died right there on the barn floor. Sam had been watching from the hayloft. He got out before Silas arrived. Silas came in, looked at what his son had done, and made his decision in about 30 seconds. He told Hannah to sign a statement saying Ben had died in an accident. She refused. Silas had her locked up the same afternoon and started spreading the theft story by evening. Caleb listened to all of it without interrupting. "Sam's the only other witness," he said. "Yes. Do you know where he went?" Hannah looked at the table. "Ben used to take Sam to an old chapel east of the Miller Creek Road. When the weather turned bad, when things got rough at the ranch. I think Sam might have gone there." Caleb looked at Lily, who was still drawing, pretending not to listen. "We go tomorrow," he said. "Lily stays here with Webb," Hannah straightened. "I'm going with you." "Your ribs." "I know where the chapel is," she said. "You don't." He studied her for a moment, then he nodded. They rode out the next morning in the thin early light before the roads got busy. The chapel sat at the end of a rutted track that hadn't seen regular use in years, half hidden by scrub cedar and a collapsed fence line. Inside, someone had recently cleared a space in the corner, a flour sack. Empty, A burned-out candle. Boot prints in the dust, small ones, a boy's size. Caleb crouched and looked at the marks. Hannah stood near the door, scanning the room. She crossed to the far corner, where the floorboards were soft and uneven. She stopped, scratched into the wood, rough and hurried, were words. She read them out loud. They found me. Ben's body is at Dry Hollow. The tracks led east. Caleb read them from the saddle, fresh enough that the edges hadn't crumbled yet. 2 horses, moving fast. The trail bent away from the chapel and cut across open scrubland toward the rocky ground near Miller Creek. Hannah rode beside him, her back straight despite the ribs. She hadn't complained once since they'd left the ranch. "We need to go to Grant," Caleb said. "Not yet. He's a fair man, Hannah. I've known him 6 years. Fair men in this county still answer to Boone when the pressure gets high enough." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. If we walk into town with Sam before we have Ben's body, Boone will know within the hour. He'll move it. And if we don't go to Grant, we have 2 people's word against the richest man in the county. "That's already what we have," she said. "But it won't be, once we find Ben." Caleb pulled his horse up slightly. "I've built everything I have by working inside the law, by trusting that the system holds when you give it the chance." Hannah turned to look at him. "I believe in the law, too. I believed in it when I refused to sign Boone's statement. I believed in it when they put me in that room anyway." She held his gaze. "The law needs something to work with before it can help us. Let's give it something." He wanted to push back. He could feel the argument sitting right there, ready. But she wasn't wrong, and he knew it. He clicked his tongue and kept riding. They found Sam an hour later. He was wedged into a narrow rock ravine, about 2 miles northeast of the chapel, tucked back far enough that you'd miss him if you weren't looking for signs. He had a long scrape down his left forearm and a bruised eye that had mostly closed. And he looked up at the sound of hooves with the expression of someone who had already decided he was caught and was only waiting to see how bad it would be. Then he saw Hannah. He was on his feet before she'd finished dismounting. She caught him by the shoulders and held him at arm's length, looking him over quickly. "Where else are you hurt?" "Just the arm," he said. "And my ankle a little. I jumped from the wagon when they had me. Hit the ground wrong. Can you ride?" "Yes, ma'am." Caleb stepped forward. "I'm Caleb Reed. Hannah's been staying at my ranch." He kept his voice even, non-threatening. "You're safe right now, but we need to move." Sam looked at him, measuring. Then he nodded. They got him onto the spare horse and started back. Sam talked while they rode, filling in the pieces Hannah hadn't known. He'd watched Roy Boone beat Sam with a leather strap for dropping a bucket of nails. Ben Hayes had walked into the barn midway through and told Roy to stop. Roy had told Ben to mind his business. Ben had stepped in front of Sam anyway. Roy picked up the iron handle from the workbench, Sam said. His voice was flat in the way voices go when a person has told themselves something terrible enough times to get the feeling to stop. It had his initials on it. He kept it on a special hook in his office because he liked the look of it. He paused. He only hit Ben once. That was all it took. Caleb listened without speaking. "Ben's buried under a lightning-scared oak in Dry Hollow," Sam continued. "I saw where they put him before I ran. 2 of Boone's men dug the hole." Silas watched. "You're willing to say all that in front of Sheriff Grant?" Caleb asked. Sam glanced at Hannah. "He's a fair man," she said quietly. "Caleb trusts him." "Yes, sir," Sam said. "I'll say it." They were 2 miles from the ranch when the riders came out of the tree line. 4 of them spread across the road, moving at a controlled canter. Tidwell was in front. Caleb's hand went to his rifle. "Don't," Hannah said low, "and quick." She was already scanning the terrain to their left. A slope dropped away from the road there, steep and narrow, threading down between 2 rock shelves into a dry creek bed. It wasn't a good path. It was barely a path at all. "Hannah, give me the reins." She was already reaching. "Keep Sam between us." He let her take them. She turned both horses, hard left, and pushed them down the slope before Tidwell's men had closed half the distance. The wagon wasn't built for this kind of ground, and Caleb knew it. but she kept the horses steady through the drop, reading the terrain 2 steps ahead, easing pressure on the left rein when the rock shelf forced them right, giving them their heads on the loose shale where balance mattered more than direction. Behind them, shouting, the sound of horses, refusing the slope. Caleb turned in the saddle and fired once, not at anyone, just over their heads, enough to give them something to think about. The riders pulled up. By the time Tidwell found a way around, they were in the creek bed and moving fast toward the ranch's back boundary. They came in through the north gate. Sam sat down on the porch steps and didn't say anything for a while. Caleb unhitched the horses, then stood with his hands on the fence rail, looking at nothing in particular. "You've done that before," he said. "On terrain like that." Hannah was checking the near horse's foreleg. "The Boone Ranch runs through bad country in the southwest corner. I learned to navigate it." "You learned to navigate it, or you learned to escape through it?" She looked up. "Both." That evening, after Sam had eaten and been set up in the guest room, with the window nailed shut and a chair under the door handle, Caleb found Curtis and sent him quietly toward town, with a message for Sheriff Grant. No details, just a request to come alone after dark to the north gate. He didn't tell Hannah. He wasn't sure why, except that it felt like the right time, and he knew she might argue, and he was tired of arguing about things they both actually agreed on. She found out anyway. She always seemed to. She came out to the porch where he was sitting and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. "You sent for Grant," she said. "We have a witness, and we know where the body is. We needed to move." She was quiet for a moment. He expected the argument. Instead, she said, "You could have told me I know," he said. "I should have." Another pause. Then she came and sat in the other chair, and they watched the dark together without speaking until Curtis's horse came back through the north gate with a shape behind it. Sheriff Grant was a long, weathered man with a gray mustache and the expression of someone permanently unsurprised by the world. He sat in Caleb's kitchen and listened without interrupting, while Hannah told him what she'd witnessed. Then he listened to Sam. He asked 3 questions, all of them specific, none of them designed to catch them in anything. "Your accounts match," he said finally. "Because we're telling the truth," Hannah said. "I believe you." He folded his hands on the table. "But I can't arrest Silas Boone on testimony alone, not him, not in this county. I need physical evidence before I can move." "Ben's body," Caleb said, "and ideally the weapon." Grant looked at Sam. "You said Roy kept an iron handle in his office." "Yes, sir, short, with his initials engraved on it." Grant sat back all right. "We go to Dry Hollow." He stayed the night in Caleb's barn, rather than ride back to town and explain his absence. They planned to leave at first light. Caleb checked Sam's room one last time before going to bed. The chair was still under the handle. The window was still nailed. He went to bed. An hour before dawn, he woke to the feeling that something was wrong. He went to the hallway. He listened. Then he opened Sam's door. The room was empty. The chair had been moved aside carefully, not knocked over. The window was still nailed shut. On the pillow, sitting where a person's head would rest, was a small metal badge, circular, stamped with a letter. B. Caleb picked it up. He stood in the empty room for a long moment, his thumb moving over the raised letter on the badge. And the only sound in the house was the wind pushing against the nailed-up window. Hannah blamed herself. She sat at the kitchen table, with her hands flat on the wood, and went through every hour of the previous evening. What she'd seen, what she'd missed, what she should have caught. Caleb came in from Sam's room and set the badge on the table between them. She looked at it. Did anyone get in? No. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. I checked every window and door. Nothing forced. He paused. Sam left on his own. Why would he heard riders approaching. Curtis saw firelight south of the property around midnight. Caleb turned the badge in his fingers. Sam's 15. He heard men coming and decided if he stayed, Lily would be in the middle of it. Hannah looked at the badge again. That's a Boone Ranch badge. Sam must have taken it from one of the men who grabbed him. Kept it as proof, maybe, or just kept it. Caleb set it down. He left it, so we'd know he'd been here, so we'd know it was real. Sheriff Grant appeared in the doorway, pulling on his coat. Where would the boy go? The hayloft, Hannah said. She'd said it before she'd thought it through, but it was right. Sam had gone to the hayloft at the chapel when things went wrong. He'd gone high and hidden and waited. Caleb was already moving. They found Sam in the barn's upper loft, buried under loose hay with his knees pulled up and the Boone badge clutched in his hand. When Caleb's lantern found him, he looked up with the flat, braced expression of someone who'd made peace with being found. I heard horses, Sam said. I know, Caleb said. He climbed up and sat beside the boy in the hay. Next time, you wake me up. You don't run. Sam looked at his hands. I didn't want Lily to get hurt because of me. She won't. But you running alone in the dark doesn't help anyone. Caleb kept his voice steady, understand? Sam nodded. They came back inside, and Sheriff Grant took Hannah's statement first, then Sam's at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and a pot of coffee between them. He wrote everything down in a small notebook, slow and careful. I need physical evidence before I can move on Boone, he said again when he'd finished. We go to Dry Hollow today, all of us. They rode out mid-morning, 5 of them. Caleb, Hannah, Sam, Sheriff Grant, and Dr. Webb, who Grant had insisted on bringing because he needed a medical opinion that would hold up in a county court. They went by the long route, skirting the main road, cutting through the back of Caleb's north pasture, and across the Miller Creek, crossing where the water was low. Dry Hollow was a shallow basin, about 4 miles out, ringed by scrub oak and limestone outcroppings. The lightning-scared tree wasn't hard to find. A single large oak stood apart from the others, its upper trunk split and blackened, the scar running all the way down to the roots. The ground beneath it had been disturbed. Webb set down her bag and directed the work calmly, and Caleb and Grant did the digging while Hannah kept Sam back a few paces. It didn't take long. Whoever had buried Ben hadn't planned for permanence. Webb examined the remains carefully and thoroughly, without rushing. When she finished, she stood and straightened her coat. The injury to the skull is consistent with a single concentrated blow from a blunt instrument, she said. Rounded edge, relatively short striking surface. This was not a fall. This was not a kick. She looked at Grant. Someone struck this man with considerable force and intention. Grant wrote it down. Sam said. Roy kept the handle on a special hook in his office. He said it reminded him that the ranch had order. If we can match the striking surface to the injury, that's enough, Webb said. Combined with 2 eyewitness accounts and the recovered remains, that's a case. The weapon's in Boone's office, Hannah said. Then that's where we need to go, Grant said, carefully and with proper authority. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon. The sky was wide and pale, and the light was going gold across the pasture. Nobody said much. After the horses were put up and Sam had gone inside with Webb, Caleb found Hannah at the fence along the south pasture, looking out at nothing in particular. He stood beside her. After a while, he said, Lily's mother left in the spring, April of '79. He rested his forearms on the top rail. She told me the quiet out here got into her bones, said. She woke up most mornings feeling like she was disappearing. He paused. I understood it, I think. I just couldn't fix it. Hannah was quiet. I spent a long time after that, being careful about who I let close, he said. Lily, the horses, the work. That's a manageable list. Hannah looked down at her hand. On the rail, I've never stayed. Anywhere long enough to find out if I'd be asked to leave. She turned the thought over, like she was hearing it, for the first time herself. It's easier to go before that happens. Easier, Caleb said. Not better, she glanced at him. I know, she said quietly. They stood there a while longer. The light kept changing, the way it does in October, going from gold to copper to something almost red, before it gives up entirely. Then Hannah said, I'll give Grant a formal statement, a real one, whatever he needs. Caleb looked at her. That makes you Boone's primary target. I already am. She pushed off the fence rail. At least this way, it means something. He wanted to say something else. He didn't quite get there. The smell hit them both at the same moment, smoke. They turned toward the barn. The hay barn on the east side of the property was burning, the fire already well up into the roof. Orange light rolling out through the gaps in the boards and climbing the door frame. Curtis was shouting from the yard, and Caleb was running before he'd made the decision to run. They fought it for 2 hours. They saved the main barn and the house, but the hay barn was gone. When the last of it fell in, Caleb stood in the yard with a wet feed sack in his hands and ash on his face, and said nothing. Hannah stood beside him. Nailed to the fence post nearest the road, where someone had put it before the fire started, was a folded paper. Caleb pulled it free and opened it. The letters were large and the message was short. Take back your story, or the child will pay. By morning, the hay barn was a black skeleton. Caleb walked the perimeter of it at first light, alone, while the others were still inside. He counted what was left. Not much. Enough ash and charred timber to tell him. The winter feed was gone, and enough clear sky overhead to remind him that winter wasn't far off. Curtis met him at the fence line. Hendricks won't sell us replacement feed. Dobson neither. I rode over to ask first thing. He kept his voice low and even, but Caleb could read what was underneath it. Boone's been to both of them. Caleb nodded slowly. Morrison canceled the spring horse contract this morning, Curtis added. Sent a boy with a letter. Caleb took the letter, read it, folded it back along its crease, and put it in his coat pocket. He stood there looking at the ruins of the barn for a long while. Dr. Webb found him there an hour later. She came around the side of the house with her bag and her straight-backed walk and stopped beside him. I can arrange transport, she said, for Hannah and Sam to the county seat. I know people there who have room and enough distance from Boone's reach to make it safe. She glanced at him. It's a real option, Caleb. Not a perfect one, but real. I know it is. You should tell her. He did that afternoon. Hannah was at the kitchen table with Sam, going over the details of his testimony, making sure the sequence of events was clear in his mind and would stay that way under questioning. She was patient with him in a methodical way, correcting without embarrassing, asking him to repeat things, not because she doubted him, but because she wanted him confident. Caleb waited until Sam went outside. Then he sat down across from her. Webb can get you and Sam out of the county, he said. Protected transport to the county seat. People Boone can't touch. He kept his voice level. You should take it. Hannah looked at him for a moment. You're doing it again. Doing what? Deciding what's best for me. She wasn't loud about it. She didn't need to be. You've decided the situation is too dangerous, and you're presenting me with the exit, like it's the only reasonable choice a sensible person would make. I'm trying to keep you safe. I know you are, but protection without choice is just a gentler word for control. She held his gaze. I've had enough of that from men who told themselves the same thing Boone told himself. That they knew best. That the woman couldn't be trusted to understand her own situation. Caleb opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He sat with that for a moment. You're right, he said. She blinked, like she'd been ready for a longer fight. I'm doing it because I'm scared, he said. For Lily, for you, and when I get scared, I try to move people out of the path of whatever's coming. He looked at the table. I've been doing that a long time. Doesn't make it right. Hannah was quiet. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him that first night in the wagon, measuring the distance between what a person said and what they meant. Then something in her face settled. I'll think about Webb's offer, she said. Honestly, I'm not dismissing it. She thought about it through the afternoon, and Caleb could see her thinking, could see her turning it over, while she helped him sort through what was salvageable from the ruined barn, while she stacked charred timber in a pile, and set aside anything that might still have use. She worked steadily, conserving her energy, still careful with the ribs. By evening, she had her answer. I'm staying, she said, until Sam is safe and Boone can't reach any of us. Then I'll decide what comes next. She looked at him directly. That's my choice, made with a clear head. I need you to accept it without arguing. Accepted, Caleb said. They worked until dark. Curtis and the two other hands helped bring in hay from the north pasture storage. Not enough for the full winter, but enough to buy time. Sam worked alongside them without being asked, quiet and steady, loading and carrying, until his arms gave out, and Caleb sent him inside. Webb stayed for supper. She told Lily a story about a horse she'd once treated that had walked 3 miles on a broken shoe without complaint. Lily listened with her chin in her hands and her eyes wide. After supper, Caleb stood at the front window. To the south, in the far pasture, a line of orange light was moving across the grass. "Fire," he said. Curtis was already shouting from outside. The hands grabbed water buckets and wet sacking and ran for the south gate. Caleb grabbed his rifle. He looked back at Hannah. "Stay with Lily." He ran. The fire in the south pasture was deliberate and well-placed, burning along the dry grass toward the winter grazing land. It took all 4 of Caleb's hands and most of an hour to contain it. By the time they had it out, the horses in that pasture had been pushed north and 2 fence sections were down. Caleb was coming back through the yard gate when he heard the sound from the house. A crash, then silence, then nothing at all, which was worse. He ran. The back door was open. Inside, a chair lay on its side, and a tin cup had rolled to the base of the stove. He went through every room. Lily's room was empty. Hannah was on the hallway floor, one hand pressed to the side of her head, pushing herself up from her knees. There was a cut above her ear, not deep but bleeding freely down her jaw. "They took her," Hannah said. Her voice was flat with shock. 2 men came in through the back. I had Sam out the window before they got to him. She got to her feet unsteady. I tried to get to Lily. One of them hit me." She looked at Caleb with an expression he had never seen on her face before. "She was right there, and I couldn't." "It's not your fault," he said. Caleb steadied her by the shoulders, looked at the cut on her head, and made himself focus. "Sam, where is he?" "Outside. I told him to run to the Harmon property and stay down." "Good." He looked at the room, at the knocked-over chair, and the open back door, and the empty space where his daughter had been. He breathed in once, slow, and breathed out. On the kitchen table, in the center of it, sat Lily's rag doll, the one she'd had since she was 4 years old and had never left on a table in her life. Beside it was a folded note. He picked it up and read it. "Hannah comes to the old warehouse alone before midnight." Caleb read the note twice. Then he set it down on the table very carefully, like it was something that might break, and stood with his hands flat on the wood and his head bowed. Hannah read it over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Hannah said, "I'll go." "No, Caleb, no." He turned around. His face was controlled, but just barely. "Boone will not trade Lily for you. He'll take you inside, find out where Sam is, and then you'll both disappear before morning." He shook his head. "That's not a trade. That's a trap. I know it's a trap." Hannah's voice was steady. "But Lily is 8 years old, and she's alone in that warehouse, and every hour we spend standing here." "I know." He turned away again, pressing both hands against the edge of the table. "I know." She watched his back, the rigidity of it, the effort it was taking him to hold himself still. "You can't keep her safe by losing you," he said. His voice had dropped. "I can't let you walk in there." "You love me," Hannah said quietly, "and that doesn't give you the right to take away my choices." He went very still. She hadn't planned to say it that way, but it was out, and it was true, and she stood by it. He turned around slowly. "Yes," he said. "I love you." He said it plainly, like a man stating a fact about the land or the weather. "And I know what that means and what it doesn't mean." He exhaled. "It doesn't mean I get to make this decision for you." The kitchen was quiet around them. The lamp was low, and the night was pressing against the windows, and somewhere out in that dark was his daughter. "Then stop trying to," Hannah said, "and help me build a plan we can both walk out of." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Tell me what you're thinking." They worked through it quickly. Sam came in from the dark, having doubled back from the Harmon property the moment he realized what had happened. He sat at the table and didn't waste time on guilt. "I've been to that warehouse," he said. "I delivered feed there twice last spring. There's a main door on the front and a loading entrance on the west side. But behind the horse stalls on the north wall, there's a service passage, barely wide enough for a man. It comes out behind the feed room. Boone won't expect anyone to know about it," Caleb said. "He might have men on the west entrance," Hannah said. "He won't think about the north wall." Grant arrived 20 minutes later. Curtis had written for him the moment the note was found. Grant read it at the table, asked 3 questions, and said, "Walk me through what you have." They laid it out. Hannah would go in through the main doors, visible, hands open. She would tell them she'd come alone and came to negotiate. She would stall. Her real objective was to find Lily. Once she located her, she would hang a strip of red cloth from the loft window. That would be Caleb's signal to bring Grant through the service passage. "And if they search you," Grant said. "They'll find the cloth," Hannah said. "Then I improvise." Grant looked at Caleb. "She knows what she's doing," Caleb said. Hannah cut a strip from the hem of her spare dress, red cotton, and tied it inside her sleeve, where it could be pulled free quickly. Sam drew the layout of the warehouse from memory on a piece of brown paper, marking the passage entrance with a cross. They had 2 hours before midnight. Caleb walked Hannah to the front door of the house while Grant and Sam went to get the horses. He stopped her just outside. "When this is over," he said, "I know you'll have to decide what comes next. What you want, where you want to be." He looked at her directly. "I want you alive and free to make that choice, even if you choose a life that doesn't include me." Hannah looked up at him. He was close enough that she could see the ash still on his jaw from the fire, and the tiredness behind his eyes, and the effort it cost him to mean what he was saying. She leaned up and kissed him. It was brief and certain, and when she stepped back, she didn't look away. "Don't be late," she said. She rode to the warehouse alone, coming up the main road at a steady pace. The building was dark from the outside, but she could see light between the boards and hear horses shifting in the stalls. She dismounted and walked to the front doors and pushed them open. 3 men were inside, plus Tidwell. They had lanterns hung from the ceiling beams and rifles leaned against the posts. Tidwell came forward and looked past her into the dark outside. "Alone?" he said. "Alone." He held out his hand. She gave him the small knife she'd kept at her belt. She didn't give him the cloth. They bound her wrists in front of her and led her to a side room where Silas Boone was waiting in a straight-backed chair like he was holding court. He looked at her the way he always had, like she was a problem with an obvious solution. "You made a sensible decision," he said. Hannah didn't answer. "Tell me where the Walker boy is, and this ends tonight. You and the child both go free." She looked at him steadily. She had no intention of telling him anything. She needed time. "I want to see Lily first," she said. Silas nodded at Tidwell. Through the wall to her left, she heard the sound of a door being unlocked. She heard Lily's voice, small and scared, but intact. And then, from somewhere deeper in the building, she heard Roy Boone speaking to someone in a low, flat tone. She couldn't make out most of it, but the last part came through clearly. "We can't let any of them live until morning." The room they locked her in was small and smelled like old hay and rusted iron. A single lantern hung outside the door, and its light came through the gap at the bottom in a thin orange line. Hannah sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her bound wrists resting on her knees and listened. Boone's voice carried through the partition. He was calm out there. Calm the way men are when they've already decided how things will end and are just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. She heard him tell Tidwell that Sam would surface within a day, once Hannah was no longer available to protect him. He talked about the county seat, about a man he knew on the circuit court, about how long it took for questions to die down when the people asking them weren't around to keep asking. She understood then that there had never been a trade. There was never going to be one. Lily was leveraged to get Hannah inside the building, and Hannah was leveraged to bring Sam into the open And once Boone had what he needed from both of them, the plan Roy had outlined through the wall would take care of the rest. She looked at her wrists. The rope was tight, but not professional. Whoever had tied it knew how to secure a man who might fight. They didn't know how to secure a woman who had spent the last 6 years working around horses and had learned early on to carry a thin strip of barrel hoop metal sewn flat into the hem of her dress, for reasons she'd never had to explain to anyone. She worked it free with her fingers. It took time. She didn't rush. When the metal strip was in her hand, she started on the knot, finding the tension point and pressing in at the angle that would give her the most movement with the least noise. The rope loosened by degrees. She kept her breathing slow. Outside, Boone's voice faded toward the front of the building. The orange line under the door stayed steady. She got one hand free, then the other. She set the rope down quietly and stood up. The partition wall between her room and the horse stalls was rough-sawn boards with a gap at the bottom, where the floor had settled unevenly, about 18 inches of clearance. She got down on her stomach, turned her head sideways, and pulled herself through. The stalls were dark, and the horses shifted when they smelled her, ears coming forward. She moved along the wall, one hand on the boards, counting doors. The third one was latched from the outside with a heavy iron pin. She heard Lily on the other side, not crying, just making the small sounds a frightened child makes when she's trying very hard not to. Hannah lifted the pin. She opened the door just enough to slip inside, and then she was on her knees in the hay, and Lily was pressed against her with both arms around her neck and shaking. "I've got you," Hannah said, quiet into her hair. "I've got you. Don't make a sound. Can you do that?" Lily nodded against her shoulder. "Good girl." Hannah checked her over quickly in the dark. No injuries. They'd frightened her badly, but hadn't hurt her. She was still wearing her boots, which mattered because the floor of this building was uneven and full of loose iron hardware. Hannah looked up at the loft above the stall. Then she looked at the door and thought about the cloth inside her sleeve. Tidwell had searched her, not carefully enough. She pulled the red strip free and held it. The loft window was above them, a square of slightly lighter dark against the wall. If she could get it up there, Caleb would see it, if he was in position. If Grant's arm had stopped bleeding long enough for them to move. If the plan was still running the way they'd built it. She didn't know any of that. She only knew what she could control. She looked around the stall. There was a length of leather rein hanging from a peg near the door. On the opposite wall, a rack of grooming tools, a curry comb, a stiff brush, a long-handled mane rake. She looked at the large stallion in the end stall. Dark bay, 16 hands at least, with the kind of energy that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with being penned up too long. His gait was heavy and latched, but the latch was the same type as the others, lift and slide. She went to him slowly, hand out, and let him smell her. He blew air through his nose and shifted his weight, but didn't pull back. She ran her palm along his jaw. She looked at the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling beam above the center aisle, out of reach from the floor, but not from the loft ladder. She turned to Lily. "I need you to do something for me," she said, "and I need you to be very quiet while you do it." Lily straightened and looked at her with full attention. "Your papa taught you a light signal for emergencies. Do you remember it?" Lily's eyes went wide. She nodded. "Can you do it with a lamp?" Another nod. "Then we're going to climb up there," Hannah said, "and you're going to signal him." She went up the loft ladder first and pulled Lily up behind her. The loft ran the length of the building, with loose hay underfoot, and the window at the far end, maybe 40 feet away. Hannah moved low and quiet. She unhooked the lamp from its ceiling beam and carried it to the window. She lifted the cloth strip and hung it over the window frame, one end out. Then she handed the lamp to Lily. "Slow," she said, "just like he taught you." Lily held the lamp up and began moving the shutter in a careful, repeated pattern. Her hands were steady. She'd been practicing this as a game, Hannah realized. Caleb had turned it into a game, so she'd remember it without being afraid of it. He'd thought about this kind of moment long before it arrived. They waited. Below them, she heard Roy's voice moving back through the building. Hannah looked at the ladder. She looked at the stallion's gate from above, and the position of the lamp hook and the angle of the aisle. She'd spent 6 years learning where horses moved when they panicked and where they didn't. She knew what they did to an aisle, when the thing that frightened them was behind them instead of in front. She climbed back down. At the stallion's gate, she hesitated one moment, not from fear, but from the knowledge of what came next and the commitment it required. Then she lifted the latch and pulled the gate open and moved clear of the swing. The stallion came out hard. He hit the aisle at a full run, and the other horses answered immediately. 2 of them kicking their gates open within seconds, a third one rearing, and coming down on the wood with both front hooves. The noise was immediate and total. Roy stepped into the aisle from the far end with a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. Hannah was already moving. She grabbed the leather rein from the peg as she went and came out of the stall shadow into the aisle at a run and swung the rein across Roy's gun hand with everything she had. The revolver went sideways but didn't fall. He caught it with his other hand and turned. He looked at her across the chaos of horses and lantern light and dust. "Step out," he said. Hannah stepped back into the shadow instead and said, "Ben Hayes. You remember him?" Roy's face changed. "Sam Walker is alive," she said. "He's given his statement to Sheriff Grant." He told them about the iron handle. "The one with your initials." Roy moved toward her. The horses were still running the aisle, one of them cutting between them, and Roy shoved it aside without looking away from her. "Sam is 15 years old," Hannah said, still moving back, measuring the distance to Lily's stall. "He watched you kill a man for stepping between you and a boy half your size. He will say that in open court." "No, he won't," Roy said. He raised the revolver. From the loft above, a small voice called down, "Papa! Papa!" Roy looked up, and in the second his eyes moved off her, Hannah heard the rear passage door come open. She stepped into the light. Not because Roy told her to, but because she needed him looking at her, and not at the rear of the building, not at the narrow passage door that had just opened. Roy's revolver came back down and found her. "Where's the boy?" he said. "I don't know. You came here alone? Because Boone has the girl. You wouldn't do that unless you thought you were trading. So you either brought the boy, or you know where he is." He came closer. "Which is it?" Hannah held her ground. The horses had pushed toward the front of the building, bunched together near the main doors, still blowing and shifting. The aisle between her and Roy was clear now, about 20 feet of open ground, and a lantern swinging from a beam above it. She glanced up. The red cloth was still in the window. She didn't know if Caleb had seen it. She didn't know if he'd made it through the passage. All she knew was that she needed more time, and she had one thing left to use. "Ben died protecting Sam," she said. "You know that. You were there." Roy's jaw tightened. "Sam didn't run because he was afraid of you," she continued. "He ran because he was 15 years old, and he'd just watched a man die for trying to help him. And he knew he couldn't do anything about it." Alone, she kept her voice even. "He found people who could. Shut up. He found me. And I found Caleb Reed. And Caleb Reed found Sheriff Grant." She watched Roy's face. "Ben's body is out of the ground. Dr. Webb has examined it. Your iron handle is the next piece. And Grant already has a description of it from 2 witnesses. He knows where it is. You think a county sheriff is going to move against my father. I think he already has." The rear door opened fully. Caleb came through first, moving low along the wall. Grant was behind him, one arm wrapped and moving slower, and behind Grant were 2 men Hannah didn't recognize, both carrying rifles. Roy heard them. He swung the revolver toward Caleb. Hannah pulled the rope she'd looped around the loft support post and hauled it sideways. The loop was tied to the loft ladder. The ladder swung out from the wall and struck Roy's wrist hard, forcing in the shot up and wide. The bullet went into a ceiling beam and sent splinters raining down into the hay. Caleb crossed the aisle in 3 strides and drove his shoulder into Roy before he could raise the gun again. They went down together into the loose hay, Roy trying to bring the revolver around, Caleb's hand on his wrist. Hannah ran for Lily's stall. At the front of the building, the main doors burst open. Silas Boone had a grip on Lily's arm and was moving toward a wagon hitched just outside the doors. Lily was pulling against him with everything she had, her boots skidding in the dirt, both hands trying to pry his fingers loose. She wasn't crying. She was furious. Hannah hit the doorframe at a run. Silas was already at the wagon. He grabbed the sideboard to pull himself up, Lily still in his grip, and Hannah caught the driving reins with both hands and hauled back with her full weight. The horses lurched sideways, and the wagon jerked, and Silas lost his footing on the step. He let go of Lily to catch himself. That was all Hannah needed. She pulled Lily away from the wagon wheel and pushed her back toward the doorway. Silas regained his footing and turned. He was an old man, but he was a large one, and his face had gone past anger into something colder. "You have nothing," he said. "A housekeeper and a runaway boy. That's all you have." "We have Ben's remains," Hannah said. "We have Dr. Webb's examination. We have Sam's statement. We have your foreman's full account of how the payroll money ended up in your own safe." She held the reins so the horses couldn't bolt. "And we have your son, right now, being taken off the floor of this warehouse by Sheriff Grant." Silas looked past her into the building. Grant had Roy on his feet, with his hands behind him. One of the 2 ranchers had Tidwell against the wall. Caleb stood in the center of the aisle, watching Silas with his rifle at his side. Silas looked at his son, at Grant, at the men holding his foreman. Then he looked at Boone's foreman, Tidwell, who was not a young man and had not planned to be the one left holding an empty rifle, while Silas drove away in a wagon with a kidnapped child. Tidwell said, "You told me to clear the men out of the back office before Grant arrived, the morning Ben died. He said it to the room, to no one and everyone. You told me where to dig." Silas went very still. "You said." "Hannah took the payroll," Tidwell said. "I didn't know it was still in your safe until this afternoon." He looked at Grant. "I'll testify to all of it. Every piece." Grant came forward and took Silas Boone by the arm. Silas didn't fight it. He looked at the wagon, at the open road beyond it, and then at Hannah standing between him and both, and he seemed to understand that the road had run out. Grant's men led them both outside. Sam came through the rear passage last, with Dr. Webb right behind him. He'd ridden hard from the Harmon place and arrived ahead of anyone's expectations. And he stood in the warehouse door and looked at the aftermath with an expression that took a long time to read. Webb sat him down in the hay and checked him over, and he let her, which meant he was more exhausted than he looked. Lily came and sat beside him. She took his hand the way she did things, without ceremony, like it was simply the obvious thing to do. Roy was subdued and handcuffed near the front post. He'd stopped fighting when he saw his father in Grant's custody. He hadn't said anything since. Caleb went through the building carefully, checking each room, making sure it was clear. He came back and found Hannah sitting on the edge of a hay bale near the door. He stood in front of her. He looked at her wrists, at the marks from the rope, at the cut above her ear that Webb had already cleaned and closed with 2 small strips of cloth. He looked at all of it without speaking. "I'm all right," she said. "I know." He sat down beside her. Sam came in behind us. He'd been waiting at the passage entrance for 20 minutes. "How long had you been watching the window?" "Long enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I saw the cloth. Then I saw the lamp moving. I didn't need the cloth after that." She looked at him. "Lily," he said. "I recognized the signal." Hannah exhaled and looked at her hands. Outside, Grant was talking to his men in a low, organized voice. The sound of horses and movement and the business of arrest carried clearly through the open doors. Silas Boone said nothing. Roy said his father's name once, and Silas didn't answer. After the wagon carrying the Boones had moved off down the road, and the witness statements had been taken down, and the building had been cleared, the group gathered in the yard. Sam stood by the horses, looking at the dark road. Webb had her arm around his shoulders. Grant shook Caleb's hand and then Hannah's, and said the rest would be done properly, and by the law, and that he'd make certain of it. One by one the others rode, or walked toward town. Eventually, it was just Caleb and Hannah and Lily in the yard. The night was cool, and the stars were clear, and the warehouse behind them was just a building. Caleb looked at Hannah. He said, "You're free." He meant it as relief, as the good news at the end of a long night. Hannah looked toward the eastern road for a moment. At the dark line of it going out into the flat country, open in every direction, she said. "Then I still have to decide where I belong." Caleb looked at her. He didn't answer. He knew better than to answer that one for her. Lily took Hannah's hand in the dark and held it, and the three of them stood there a while longer before they turned toward home. 3 weeks passed. The county seat proceedings moved faster than Hannah had expected. Grant had done his work thoroughly before the Boones ever set foot in a courtroom, and by the time the formal charges were read, the evidence was already arranged in a sequence that left very little to interpretation. Ben's remains, Webb's examination, Sam's eyewitness account, the iron handle recovered from Roy's office, its striking surface consistent with the injury to Ben's skull. The payroll ledger found exactly where Tidwell said it would be. Tidwell's own testimony, delivered in full, without hesitation, because a man who has been left behind by the person he served for 12 years tends to have very clear memory. Hannah sat at the testimony table and gave her statement in a clear, even voice. She did not look at Silas Boone while she spoke. She looked at the court recorder, and she said exactly what she had seen, and what she had refused to do, and what had happened to her as a result. When she finished, there was a long quiet in the room. All charges against her were dismissed. Outside the courthouse, Sam stood on the steps beside her and looked at the street below. "What happens now?" he said. "You testify," Hannah said, "and then it's over. For them, I mean. Not for you." He looked at her. "You're 15, she said. "You have a lot of road left." He thought about that. A week after the testimony, Ben Hayes was buried properly. The grave was in the small cemetery east of Miller Creek, and the people who came were not the important people of the county, but the working ones. The men who had ridden with Ben, eaten beside him, patched fence with him in the rain. A few women who had known him from town. Sam stood at the grave with his hat in his hands and didn't speak. But he didn't leave early either. Dr. Webb stood beside Hannah and said, "He deserved this much. He deserved more," Hannah said. "Yes," Webb agreed. "He did." Caleb had been quiet during those weeks. Not distant. Quiet in the way. He went quiet when he was giving something real space to breathe. He worked the ranch and rebuilt the hay barn frame and negotiated 2 new contracts to replace the ones Boone's pressure had cost him. He invited Sam to stay without making a production of it. He sat Sam down at the kitchen table one evening and laid it out plainly. Regular work, fair wages, paid weekly. School in the winter months because that was not optional. A room of his own in the ranch hand quarters, with a proper bed and a lock on the door. Sam listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "You don't even know me that well. I know you jumped from a moving wagon rather than let Boone's men take you back," Caleb said. "And I know you snuck out of a locked room in the middle of the night, so a little girl wouldn't get hurt on your account." He picked up his coffee cup. "That's enough." Sam took the offer. The letter came for Hannah on a Tuesday, delivered through Webb from a family at the county seat. A housekeeping position. Full salary, comfortable house, a family with a good reputation. The letter was polite and specific, and the offer was real. Caleb put it on the table in front of her and went back to the fence work he'd been doing. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't mention it at supper. He didn't ask Lily to be particularly cheerful or particularly sad. He just set the letter down and let it sit. Lily set an extra plate on the table anyway. She'd been doing it every night since Hannah left for the county seat. Caleb had explained gently twice that Hannah had the right to choose where she went next, and that the extra plate didn't change anything. Lily kept putting it there. Hannah sat with the letter for 2 days. She read it again. She thought about the county seat house, the steady work, the distance from anyone who had ever known her as a fugitive hiding under hay. She thought about starting over the clean way, the safe way, the way that had no risk of loss, because there was nothing close enough to lose. She'd organized her life around that kind of thinking for a long time. On the third morning, she saddled her horse before breakfast and rode out toward the north pasture, where the land went wide and flat, and you could see a long way in every direction. She sat the horse on a rise and looked at the Reed Ranch below. The new barn frame going up, the horse in the south pasture. Smoke from the kitchen chimney, which meant Curtis, had started the coffee, and Sam was probably already at the fence line because it was the kind of person who got up before he had to. She looked at the road that ran along the property's eastern edge, at the milepost near the south turn, at the strip of blue ribbon tied around it that hadn't been there a week ago. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned the horse around and rode back down. She came up the road at an easy pace, past the milepost, past the old rut where the wagon had stopped that first night. She didn't slow there. She didn't look at the ditch. That piece of road was just road now. Lily saw her from the yard first. She came running the way only 8-year-olds run, full speed with no strategy, arms out, completely committed to the direction she'd chosen. Hannah dismounted and caught her and held on. Lily said into her shoulder, "I knew you'd find your way home." Hannah kept holding her for a moment. Then she straightened and looked across the yard. Caleb was standing at the barn entrance with his hat in his hand. He didn't come rushing over. He stood there and waited, which was its own kind of answer to a question she hadn't needed to ask. She walked toward him. "I didn't come back because of the debt," she said. "I need you to know that. I know it. I came back because I love you, and I love Lily." She held his gaze, "And I want to build something here if you're asking me." "I'm asking you," Caleb said. "Not to stay and work for me, not to fill a gap." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I'm asking you to be my partner, in the ranch and in everything else. Equal say, equal standing. Marriage when we're both ready, not before." Hannah looked at him. She thought about the river, how cold it had been, how she'd gone in without stopping to think, because there hadn't been time. She thought about the ditch on the south road, where she'd woken up not knowing whose hands were lifting her. She thought about all the places she'd passed through and left without looking back, and how this was the first one she'd ridden toward. "Yes," she said. He smiled. It wasn't a large smile, but it was real. Sam came around the side of the barn with a fence post over his shoulder and stopped when he saw them, reading the situation quickly. "Does this mean we're keeping her?" he said. "Sam," Caleb said. "Yes, sir." But he was already grinning and heading back toward the fence line. Webb came for supper that evening. She brought a pie she claimed was leftover, but had clearly made fresh. Grant stopped by as well and stayed for coffee and less conversation than usual, which meant he was comfortable. Afterward, when the dishes were done and Lily had been put to bed and the house was quiet, Hannah went out to the porch. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were the kind of thick you only get far from town. Caleb came and stood beside her. She could see the milepost from here, the dark shape of it against the lighter dark of the road. The blue ribbon was invisible at this distance, but she knew it was there. "Who tied the ribbon?" she said. "Lily," Caleb said. "She did it the morning you left for the county seat. Said it would help you find the way back if you needed it." Hannah looked at the milepost a moment longer. Then she looked out at the rest of it. The pasture, the barn, the flat land running away to the south, under a wide sky. In the morning, she would help Sam with the new fence sections. She would check on the bay mare's foal, who had grown fast and started following Lily around the paddock like a dog. She would sit with Caleb over the winter supply ledgers and tell him where she thought the numbers could be better. And he would listen and sometimes argue and sometimes say she was right. She would stay. Not because she owed anyone anything. Not because leaving was dangerous. Not because someone had offered her protection she was too frightened to turn down. Because she had come to the edge of the road and looked out at what was waiting, and she had chosen this. Behind her, the house was warm and lit. Ahead of her, the land ran out toward the horizon in every direction, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Hannah Cole was not watching the road for what might be coming. She was home. There's a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. Caleb Reed was standing on the side of a dusty Texas road, looking down at a woman he'd never met, beaten and left for nothing in a ditch. 3 riders were closing in behind him. His 8-year-old daughter was sitting in the wagon, and every practical instinct he had was telling him the same thing: step aside, stay out of it, keep your life simple. He was about to do exactly that, and then a small hand grabbed his sleeve. That's the thing about grace. It doesn't always come from strength or courage or moral clarity. Sometimes it comes from a child who hasn't yet learned to be afraid of the right people. Sometimes it arrives in a whisper. Sometimes it's just a memory, a cold river, a woman who didn't stop to think, who jumped in without taking off her boots. This story is set in the 1800s on the Texas frontier, but what it's really about has never gone out of style. It's about what happens when one person decides to stop walking past someone else's pain. Not because it's safe, not because it's convenient, but because they've been shown by a stranger, by a child, by a moment they didn't plan for that. Some things matter more than self-preservation. Hannah Cole is not a damsel. She's not waiting to be rescued. She's a woman who refuses to sign a lie, who negotiates from a borrowed bed with bruised ribs and nowhere to go, who frees herself from her own ropes with a strip of barrel hoop metal she sewed into her hem years before she knew she'd need it. She doesn't ask for protection. She asks for something harder to be trusted with her own choices, even when those choices carry real risk. Especially then. And Caleb is a man who has to learn something most people never fully learn. That loving someone doesn't give you the right to decide for them. That keeping someone safe and keeping someone controlled can look identical from the outside, and the difference lives entirely in who gets to make the call. He learns it imperfectly. He makes the mistake more than once, but he owns it each time, and he changes. That's rarer than it sounds. What I find most true about this story is something that never gets said out loud in it. Every character who does the right thing does so at a cost they cannot afford. Caleb risks his daughter, his land, his livelihood. Hannah risks her freedom and her life to refuse a signature. Ben Hayes walked between a man and a boy he barely knew, and it cost him everything. Sam, 15 years old, jumped from a moving wagon in the dark rather than let a little girl get hurt on his account. None of them had the luxury of doing the right thing cheaply. That's the part that stays with me. We talk a lot about integrity and courage, like they're qualities you develop in quiet moments, in safety, in situations where the stakes are low enough that virtue is easy. But this story keeps showing us integrity at the exact moment it costs something real, and it keeps showing us people paying that cost anyway. Not because they're extraordinary, but because they decided, in a specific moment with specific information, that they couldn't do otherwise. The ending isn't a rescue. Hannah doesn't stay because Caleb saved her. She stays because she chose to. She rides back down that road on her own horse, at her own pace, past the milepost where a little girl tied a blue ribbon just in case, and she makes a decision that belongs entirely to her. That distinction matters more than anything else in the story, because the whole conflict from the first scene to the last has been about who gets to make decisions about a woman's life. Silas Boone thought he did. Roy Boone thought he did. Even Caleb, in his better-intentioned way, had to be reminded that he didn't. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. All characters, events, and situations depicted are entirely fictional and not intended to represent any real persons or historical events.